I was holding another woman's child at the airport while his pregnant wife stood 30 feet away, frozen in the middle of the terminal, one hand pressed flat against her belly. That was it. That was the moment. Not a fight, not a confession, not even a look exchanged between them. Just a little girl, barely 3 years old, wrapping her arms around a man's neck and calling him daddy. And that man being the same person who had called Naomi Brooks Moretti the night before, his voice thick with exhaustion, telling her he loved her and that he'd be home soon. Naomi had memorized that voice. She had fallen asleep to it for 3 years, and now here it was, attached to a man she no longer recognized. If that had been you standing in that terminal, 7 months pregnant, mother just rushed to the hospital, boarding pass in your hand, what would you have done? Would you have screamed? Would you have confronted him right there, in front of the woman, in front of the child, in front of every stranger wheeling their luggage past? Or would you have done what Naomi did, which was nothing, which was worse than screaming? Before we go any further, if you're new here, subscribe right now and turn on the bell. Stories like this one, we release them every week, the kind that stop you mid-sentence and make you put your phone down just to breathe. You don't want to miss what's coming in the next 4 parts of this story. And while you're watching, drop a comment telling me your city, your country, wherever you're seeing this from. I want to know how far this story travels. Hit that like button too. It means more than you think. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Naomi Brooks grew up in a house where the heat didn't always work, and dinner was sometimes crackers and peanut butter, and no one made a big deal of either. Her mother, Patricia, had raised her and her younger brother Marcus on a hospital administrator's salary after their father left, when Naomi was 9. Not dramatically, not violently, just quietly, the way some men leave, like a faucet slowly losing pressure until one day there's nothing. Patricia never spoke badly about him. That was the thing Naomi carried into adulthood more than anything else her mother taught her. You don't poison the well just because someone left you thirsty. She said it exactly once, when Naomi was 16 and angry, and Naomi never forgot it. She became a librarian. Not because she couldn't have been other things. She was sharp, careful, the kind of woman who read contracts before she signed them and kept her receipts and never once bounced a check. But because she loved the particular quiet of a library, the way information waited patiently for the right person to come looking. She liked being part of that. She met Lucien Moretti at a charity auction fundraiser that a mutual friend had dragged her to on a Tuesday night when she would have rather been home. She almost didn't go. She had told her friend Claire twice that she wasn't in the mood, that she had a headache, that she was saving up her social energy for a birthday dinner that weekend. Claire had shown up at her apartment door anyway, holding a dress she'd borrowed without asking, and a look on her face that said, "Naomi, I swear to God." So Naomi went. Lucien was standing near the back of the room when she first noticed him, and the first thing she thought was not that he was handsome, though he was, in the kind of way that made you feel slightly underdressed, but that he was listening, really listening, to an elderly man telling a very long story about a fishing trip, and he wasn't performing patience. He was genuinely there, nodding at the right moments, asking a follow-up question that proved he'd heard everything. Naomi noticed that about people. She always had. He noticed her noticing. "You're watching me like you're trying to decide something," he said, appearing at her elbow with 2 glasses of wine and offering her one. "I'm deciding whether you're actually a good listener or you're just very well trained," she said. He smiled. It reached his eyes. Both, probably. She took the wine. She did not ask what he did for a living that night. He did not offer it. They talked for 2 hours about books. He had read more than she expected, real reading, not the kind of reading men claimed as personality, and about Chicago in winter, which Naomi hated and Lucien claimed to love, and about the peculiar sadness of very large parties where most of the people didn't actually know each other. When he asked for her number, she gave him a slight pause first. Not playing a game. Just making sure she meant it. She meant it. What she didn't know, standing there in her borrowed dress with a glass of wine she'd barely touched, was that Lucien Moretti ran one of the most powerful criminal organizations on the Eastern Seaboard. That the men who'd given him approving looks across the room weren't colleagues from whatever vague import-export business he'd mentioned. They were lieutenants. That the building they were standing in had been purchased, in part, with money that could not be traced to anything clean. She didn't know any of that. And the precise, calculated truth is that Lucien didn't tell her. Not that night, not in the weeks of careful dinners that followed, not when she started calling him loose in private, not when he first said I love you on a bridge over the Chicago River on a night so cold their breath came out in small clouds. He told her 6 months in, when he was already certain she was something he couldn't afford to lose. She found out on her own, first. That was important. She found a name, Marco Ricci, that she'd heard him use on a phone call, and she'd looked it up with the same instinct she used to look up everything, carefully, quietly, following the thread wherever it led. She found enough to understand what she was dealing with before he decided how to explain it. She confronted him about it at her apartment, sitting across from him at her kitchen table with a mug of tea she didn't drink. "Tell me who you actually are," she said. He told her. Not everything. Nobody tells everything. But enough. The organization, the money, the reach. The fact that violence, when it came, was never random, which he seemed to think was some kind of moral distinction. She sat with it for a long time. "So when you said import-export, I was being honest about the structure," he said, "not the contents." "That's the most dishonest thing I've ever heard," she said. "I know." She should have walked. Every sensible, self-preserving part of her knew she should have stood up, opened the door, and ended something that hadn't yet grown too large to leave. She knew it. Patricia would have told her to leave. Claire would have told her to leave. The version of Naomi who had watched her father walk out and decided never to depend on someone who might disappear. That version would have left. But here was the complicating truth. Lucien was not a man who had hidden his capacity for love. He had shown it clearly, early, and without performance. He called her back when she didn't answer. He remembered things, small, specific things, the kind of things that couldn't be faked or scheduled. He showed up when she was sick with a terrible flu and didn't try to fix anything, just sat on the edge of her bed and read to her from whatever book was on her nightstand until she fell asleep. Nobody had ever done that before. She stayed. She told herself it was a decision made with clear eyes. Maybe it was. She knew what he was. She chose to love him anyway. That distinction mattered to her then, and it would matter to her later, but in different ways and for different reasons. They married 14 months after meeting, in a ceremony smaller than people in Lucien's world expected and larger than Naomi wanted. Patricia came. Marcus came. 100 people. Naomi didn't entirely know filled the seats on Lucien's side, and she smiled at all of them and tried not to think too hard about what bound them together. The first year was genuinely good. That's the part people forget when a marriage ends badly. There's almost always a stretch of time that was genuinely good. Not perfect. Lucien worked too much. He took calls in the middle of dinners and disappeared into his office for hours, and sometimes came home looking like he'd been carrying something too heavy in a space too small. Naomi had her own stubbornness, a tendency to go quiet instead of saying what was wrong, inherited from a mother who had learned early that complaints had to be rationed to be effective. They argued about small things with more heat than small things deserved, which was really arguing about the larger things neither of them had figured out how to name yet. But there was laughter, too. Real laughter, the unplanned kind. There were Sundays that lasted all day. There was a trip to New Orleans where they stayed in a hotel above a jazz club, and neither of them slept and neither of them minded. There were moments of such specific tenderness that Naomi held them in her memory the way you hold something fragile. Carefully, with both hands. Then they started trying for a baby. That was when the distance began. Not immediately. At first it brought them closer. The shared hope, the rituals of tracking and timing, the particular intimacy of wanting something together. But the months collected and nothing happened, and the hope slowly calcified into something heavier. Naomi started waking up at 3 a.m, her body restless with a grief she couldn't name because the thing she was grieving hadn't existed yet. Lucien became gentler, but also more absent, as if he had decided to give her space when what she needed was proximity. The fertility treatments began in the second year of marriage. They were brutal in quiet clinical ways, the injections, the waiting, the appointments that turned into a part-time job. Lucien came to the early ones. Then he started sending apologies instead of himself, small worded explanations about meetings and obligations, and "You know this deal can't wait, Naomi." She said she understood. She did understand. She also started sleeping on her side of the bed with a rigidity she hadn't noticed accumulating until she caught herself lying there one night, thinking that the space between them had become a presence of its own. Then came the third year. Lucien told her in March that operations overseas had become critical, that the European side of the organization was requiring his direct involvement for what he estimated would be several months, possibly longer. He was sorry. He hated it. But there was no one else he trusted to handle it. How long? She asked. I don't know exactly. 6 months? Maybe 8? Lucien. I know. He pressed his forehead against hers. I know. But when I come back, all of this is done. I'm stepping back from operations. We'll have time, real time, Naomi. I promise you. She believed him. She had learned by then to accept that loving a man like Lucien Moretti meant learning to hold promises loosely, not because he lied, but because his world did not respect schedules or intentions. Things changed. Circumstances evolved. She had accepted this as a cost she was willing to pay. He left in late March. The calls came regularly at first, every night, sometimes twice. His voice was tired but warm. He asked about her days with a specificity that made her feel seen. He made her laugh. He told her details about Zurich and London and Vienna that made her picture him there, worn down by the complications of whatever world he was dismantling. And then, in May, 4 years of trying, 2 rounds of IVF, 1 miscarriage that she had cried through alone because Lucien had been in the middle of a crisis somewhere he couldn't name, the test came back positive. She sat on the bathroom floor for 20 minutes holding the test and crying without sound, the way she cried when the feeling was too large for noise. Lucien wept on the phone when she told him. Wept. She had never heard him cry before, and the sound undid something in her chest that she had been quietly holding together. He said he was coming home. She told him to stay, to finish what he'd started. She could manage. She was good at managing. You shouldn't have to manage this alone, he said. I've managed everything alone, she said, and then immediately hated how it sounded. I mean, I'm fine, we're fine, go finish it. He stayed. She managed. The pregnancy was difficult in specific ways that her body seemed to take personally. Severe morning sickness that lasted into the 5th month. Blood pressure that required monitoring. A hospitalization in her 6th month that lasted 2 days and during which Lucien called 6 times and nearly got on a plane before she talked him out of it. I'm fine, she kept saying. The baby is fine. What she didn't say was, I need you here. I'm not managing as well as I'm telling you I am. I am very, very tired of being alone with all of this. She didn't say those things because she didn't want to be the kind of woman who needed to say them. That was the trap she'd built for herself, and she'd been walking around in it for years without fully recognizing its dimensions. 7 months in, her phone rang at 6:47 in the morning. Marcus. Naomi, Mom's had a heart attack. She's at Northwestern. She's stable, but you need to come. She was dressed and calling a car before she'd fully processed the sentence. She moved the way she always moved in emergencies, efficiently, without panic, her hands steady because she couldn't afford for them to shake. She packed a bag. She called the airline. She booked the first available flight to New York, where Patricia had been visiting Marcus for the past 2 weeks. She sent a text to Lucien. Mom had a heart attack. Going to New York. She's stable. We'll call when I land. And she didn't wait for a response because there wasn't time. The airport was chaos in the specific way O'Hare is always chaos. The particular density of bodies and noise and screens and rolling bags that hits you like a physical thing the moment you walk through the doors. Naomi moved through it with her hand on her belly and her carry-on over one shoulder and her eyes on the gate numbers. She stopped at the baggage claim area to check her gate assignment on the overhead screen. And that was when she saw him. Lucien was standing 30 feet away. He was wearing a coat she'd given him 2 Christmases ago, dark gray, wool, the one he'd said he loved. And he was smiling. Not the careful smile he kept for business. The real one. The one she had believed for years was something he reserved for her. Beside him stood a woman. Tall, dark-haired, dressed in the kind of simple elegance that doesn't announce itself. She was speaking to someone on a phone, one hand gesturing, her posture easy with the comfort of a person who belonged exactly where she was standing. And at Lucien's feet, tugging at his sleeve, then reaching up to be lifted, was a little girl, barely 3 years old. He lifted her without hesitating, without thinking about it, the automatic ease of a man who had done this 1,000 times. The little girl put her arms around his neck and pressed her face against his jaw and said something that Naomi couldn't hear over the terminal noise. But she saw his face when the child said it. She saw the way his eyes softened, the way his arms tightened around her, the way he laughed at something she said, a real laugh, unguarded, the laugh of a man who was not carrying anything heavy in that moment. Naomi's hand pressed flat against her belly. The baby moved, a small, rolling shift, the kind she had started feeling in the past few weeks. She stood completely still for what might have been 10 seconds or might have been 2 minutes. She did not make a sound. Lucien hadn't seen her. He was talking to the woman now, the child still in his arms, and they had the ease of a unit. Not two people standing near each other, but a specific arrangement of 3 people who knew exactly how they fit together. Naomi turned away. She walked toward her gate. She did not run. She did not cry. She did not go back. She walked with her carry-on over her shoulder and her hand on her belly and her face arranged into an expression that she would not have been able to describe if someone had asked, because she wasn't feeling one thing. She was feeling everything at once, which sometimes registers as nothing. She found her gate. She sat down in a plastic chair by the window. She watched a plane push back from the terminal, and she sat with the knowledge that the man she had tried for 3 years to have a baby with, the man she had survived a miscarriage and 2 rounds of IVF and 6 months of loneliness for, was not dismantling a criminal empire in Europe. He was 30 feet away in O'Hare Airport with a woman and a child who called him Daddy. The flight was called 40 minutes later. Naomi stood up, smoothed her coat over her belly, picked up her bag, and boarded the plane. She didn't call him. She didn't text. She sat in 14C with her seatbelt fastened and her eyes forward, and she thought about her mother, who had raised 2 children alone and never once poisoned the well. And she thought, I am my mother's daughter. I know how to survive what I don't want to survive. But first I need to know exactly what I'm surviving. The plane lifted into the gray Chicago sky. Naomi closed her eyes. The baby moved again. And somewhere in the airport below her, Lucien Moretti was laughing at something his daughter said, completely unaware that the architecture of the life he had so carefully constructed in 2 different countries had just been seen in its entirety by the one person with every reason to tear it down. Naomi landed at LaGuardia at noon and took a cab directly to Northwestern Memorial's sister hospital in Manhattan, where Patricia Brooks was sitting up in a hospital bed, looking smaller than Naomi remembered, and more annoyed about it than anyone had a right to be after a cardiac event. You didn't have to fly out here, Patricia said, the moment Naomi walked through the door. Mom. I'm serious, I'm fine. It was a minor... Mom. Naomi set her bag down on the chair by the window and crossed the room and took her mother's hand and held it, and Patricia went quiet because she knew her daughter's silences the way you know the sound of your own house settling. Not alarming, but significant. Marcus was standing near the window, arms folded, wearing the expression he'd been wearing since he was 19 and felt responsible for things he couldn't control. He caught Naomi's eye. She gave him a small nod that said, I'm okay, even though it was a lie, and he nodded back in a way that said he knew it was a lie, and he was going to respect it for now. They spent the afternoon doing hospital things, talking to the cardiologist, who was careful and specific in a way Naomi appreciated, learning the new medication protocol, watching Patricia argue with the nurse about the food, and then eat all of it anyway. Normal, terrible, necessary things. Naomi did not check her phone. At 6 in the evening, Marcus stepped out to get coffee, and Patricia looked at Naomi with the directness that had always been both her gift and her weapon as a mother. What happened? She said. Not a question. Mom, you just had a heart attack. I know what I just had. I'm asking what happened to you. You walked in here looking like someone took something from you, and you haven't decided yet whether to ask for it back. Naomi looked at the window. The city outside was doing what New York does at dusk, going gold and gray at the same time, indifferent and enormous. I saw Lucien at the airport, she said, with a woman, and a little girl. She heard her mother's breath shift. A little girl who called him Daddy. Daddy, Naomi said. Patricia was quiet for 5 full seconds. That was a long time for Patricia Brooks. How old? She finally said. 2, maybe 3. Another silence. Naomi, I'm going to handle it, Naomi said. I needed to say it out loud to someone first before I figure out what I'm doing. You don't have to figure out anything tonight. I know. Come sit down. I'm fine standing. Naomi, sit down. She sat, and for exactly 4 minutes, which she counted without meaning to, she let her mother hold her hand and say nothing, and it was the most honest thing that happened to her that entire day. She didn't cry. She wasn't ready to cry yet. Crying would come later, and it would not be pretty or cathartic or the kind of release you felt better after. It would be the kind that happened in the shower at 3 in the morning and left her feeling wrung out and somehow angry at herself for having feelings that inconvenient. But not yet. That night, after Marcus came back and the conversation turned to logistics and Patricia's discharge timeline and whether Marcus's apartment could accommodate everyone for a few days, Naomi excused herself to the hallway and stood under the fluorescent lights with her phone in her hand. Lucien had called 7 times. He had texted twice. I hope your mom is okay. Call me when you can. And then, 40 minutes later, Naomi, please call me. She stared at the text for a long time. She put the phone back in her pocket without responding. She went back into the room and told her mother about the new research on cardiac rehabilitation, which she had read about on the plane because reading was what she did when the thing she was actually thinking about was too large to look at directly. Patricia listened and asked questions and pretended this was a normal conversation, and Naomi loved her for it. She didn't sleep that night. She lay on the pull-out couch in Marcus's living room with her hands on her belly, feeling the baby move in the dark, and she thought about a little girl with her arms around a man's neck. She thought about the timing. She did the math she didn't want to do. The child was approximately 2 to 3 years old. Lucien had told her in March of this year that the European operations required him to leave. But the distance, the real distance, the kind that had weight and temperature, had started nearly 3 years ago. She had charted it, not intentionally, but she was the kind of woman who noticed patterns, and she had noticed, sometime in the 2nd year of their marriage, that Lucien had begun protecting her from things. Not the dangerous things, the emotional things, the way he went quiet after certain calls, the way he stopped initiating certain conversations, the way he had, gradually and then all at once, started treating her with a particular careful tenderness that she had interpreted as love, but which, she now understood, might have been guilt. She got up at 5 in the morning and sat at Marcus's kitchen table with a laptop and a cup of tea she made too strong, and she started looking. She had always been good at research. It was the thing that made her a good librarian. The patience to follow a thread through uncooperative databases, the instinct to know which sources were reliable, the willingness to sit with uncertainty until the evidence resolved into something she could name. She started with what she knew. The woman at the airport was European. That was her read. The posture, the coat, something in the way she'd held herself that suggested someone comfortable moving in international spaces. The child had light hair, lighter than Lucien's. The woman was perhaps 35, 40 at the outside. Elegant in a way that wasn't performative. Naomi searched the known faces of the Moretti organization's European operations. She had paid more attention over the years than Lucien probably realized. She was not a woman who chose ignorance over discomfort. She knew names, she knew territories. She knew, in general terms, how the organizational structure worked in the cities Lucien had claimed to be operating in. She found a name in 2 hours. Vivienne Hale, the daughter of a Belgian financier who had laundered money for 3 different criminal organizations before his death in 2019. A woman who had, in the years following, positioned herself as an independent broker in the European criminal finance world. The kind of person who knew everyone and owed nothing, which made her exactly the kind of person someone like Lucien would find valuable. There were photographs. Not many, Vivienne Hale was careful, but enough. Board minutes from a legitimate shipping company she held a seat on. A social photograph from a Vienna gala that Naomi had to look at 3 times before she was certain. Lucien was in the photograph, standing beside Vivienne Hale. The date stamp in the image metadata said 18 months ago. Naomi sat back in the chair. The kitchen was very quiet. She went back to looking. By 8 in the morning, she had built a timeline she didn't want to have built. Vivienne Hale had operated out of Brussels and then Vienna for the past 4 years. The Moretti organization's European branch had, according to the limited public information Naomi could find, and the things Lucien had mentioned over the years when he was being less careful than he thought, restructured significantly in that same period. Sources she found, careful ones, from financial journalists who covered organized crime with more discipline than their editors probably wished, described the restructuring as having been executed with unusual smoothness, stabilizing, professionalizing, the kind of thing that required not just operational skill but social capital, the kind of thing that required someone with existing relationships to broker, the kind of thing Vivian Hale was exactly positioned to do. Naomi stared at the screen for a long time. Then she searched for birth records, which was harder, and she didn't find a formal record, but she found, in a Vienna Society column that someone had not scrubbed carefully enough, a passing reference to Vivian Hale attending a function in October, nearly 3 years ago, described as recently returned from maternity leave. Naomi put her hands flat on the table. She breathed. She was very still. The baby moved. "I know," she said quietly, to no one, to the baby, to herself. "I know." She closed the laptop. She made another cup of tea. She sat at the kitchen table until Marcus came out at 9, blinking, in socks that didn't match, and stopped when he saw her face. "Nay," he said. "He has another family," she said, "in Europe. A woman and a daughter. The girl is about 2.5, 3 years old." She said it without drama, without a shake in her voice, because she had spent the past 4 hours building a wall around the information so she could look at it directly. "He's been maintaining both, here and there, for at least 3 years. Probably the whole time he's been telling me he was overseas working." Marcus stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. Then he pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. "What do you need?" he said. "Right now? I need you not to call him." "Naomi, Marcus, please. I need to handle this in the order I can handle it. And right now the order is, Mom comes home in 2 days, I make sure she's stable, and then I go back to Chicago and I deal with the rest of it." She looked at him. "Can you give me that?" He looked like he wanted to say about 6 different things. He said, "Yeah, okay. Thank you. For now," he added. "I know, for now." Patricia came home from the hospital on a Thursday. Naomi stayed through the weekend, helping settle her mother into Marcus's apartment, setting up the medication schedule, arguing gently and persistently until Patricia agreed to at least 1 week of rest before attempting anything independently ambitious. She cooked. She organized. She did the dozen small practical things that needed doing, because doing them kept her hands and her mind occupied, and because someone needed to do them, and that had always been her role in her family and probably always would be. Lucien called 4 more times. She let all 4 go to voicemail. She listened to the voicemails in the bathroom with the door locked. The first one, "Naomi, I'm worried about you. Please call me. How's your mother?" The second one, from the next morning, "I've been calling. I need to hear your voice. Is everything okay?" The third, "Something's wrong. I don't know what happened, but something's wrong. Naomi, call me." The fourth one was different. His voice in the fourth voicemail had a quality she had never heard in it before and couldn't fully name. Not guilt. She'd heard guilt from him, the way it made him go careful and deliberate with his words. This was something rawer, something that sounded less like a man managing a situation and more like a man who had just realized a situation had already gotten away from him. I think you may have seen something at the airport, and if you did, then I need you to know that A long pause. "I can't explain this in a message. I need to be in the same room as you. Naomi, please, call me." She pressed delete on all 4. She flew back to Chicago on a Sunday. The house was exactly as she'd left it. Large, quiet, expensive in the way Lucien's taste always expressed itself. Restrained but specific, nothing cheap, nothing flashy, just quality that had been selected rather than displayed. She walked through it with her carry-on and her coat still on, moving from room to room the way you do when you're trying to find out what a space feels like now that you know something you didn't know before. It felt different. Not smaller. Not uglier. Just differently lit. The way a photograph looks different once you know the thing that was just out of frame. She took a shower. She ate soup she heated from a can because there was nothing else in the house. She sat in the armchair in the bedroom that she'd always thought of as hers, though technically everything in the house was theirs, and she opened the laptop again and she kept going. She spent the next 6 days building a full picture, the financial architecture of the European operation, as much of it as was accessible to someone with her skills and patience. The timeline of Lucien's absences mapped against the known records of Vivian Hale's movements. The organizational structure. Who knew? Who had to have known? How many people in Lucien's inner circle had understood that the boss maintained a parallel life, and had simply filed this information in the category of things that weren't their business? The answer to that last question was most of them, not all, but most. Found an interview, an Italian business magazine, translated badly by an automated service. She then corrected manually because the errors in the machine translation were losing the nuance, in which a source described the Moretti organization's European structure as having been stabilized under new management partnership, and used a phrase that translated roughly to the woman behind the operation in a way that made clear who they were referring to. Vivian Hale had not been a secret inside the organization. She had been openly present, respected, anticipated by the people who watched organizational power as a permanent fixture. There was a word for what that made Naomi inside the same organization. She didn't say the word. She wrote it on a piece of paper, and then she folded the paper, and then she put it in a drawer. On the 7th day, Lucien's car pulled into the driveway. She heard it from the bedroom. The particular sound of his engine, the specific weight of the door closing, the particular cadence of his footsteps on the front steps. She knew these sounds the way you know music you've heard 1,000 times. Your body registers it before your mind catches up. She was sitting at the kitchen table when he came through the door. He stopped when he saw her. He looked like he hadn't slept well in a week, which was accurate. The lines around his eyes were deeper than usual, and he was holding himself the way men hold themselves when they're braced for something, shoulders slightly forward, weight not quite settled. She had placed the documents on the table in front of her. Not the divorce papers. Those were coming, but they weren't ready yet. What she had placed on the table was the timeline she'd built, printed out, organized. 8 pages, single-spaced, with sources notated in the margin in her careful librarian's handwriting. Lucien's eyes went to the papers on the table and then back to her face. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She didn't speak for a moment. She looked at him, really looked at him, and she thought about all the time she had looked at this face and believed she was seeing it clearly, and she felt something shift in her chest that wasn't grief and wasn't anger, but was the specific sensation of a thing you trusted finally becoming exactly what it was. "The little girl's name," she said. "Tell me." Something happened in his face, a collapse, small but total. "Naomi." "Tell me her name, Lucien." A long beat. "Elise," he said. "How old?" "She'll be 3 in February." Naomi nodded. "And Vivian Hale, how long?" He closed his eyes for a second. 4 years. 4 years. She said it without inflection. "Before we started trying for a baby?" "Yes." "Before the IVF?" "Yes." "Before I spent 3 months injecting hormones into my own stomach because we couldn't figure out why I wasn't getting pregnant, which, I'm now thinking, might have had something to do with the fact that your attention and energy and apparently everything else was somewhere in Vienna. It wasn't—" He stopped. "What? It wasn't like that?" She looked at him steadily. "Then tell me what it was like." He ran a hand over his face. He was not a man who fell apart easily. She had watched him handle the kind of pressure that would disintegrate most people, and he had always moved through it with a composure that she had once admired and now understood differently. But in this room, at this table, he looked like a man who had been dismantled. "I don't have a good explanation for how it happened," he said. "I'm not asking for an explanation. I'm asking for facts. The organization needed someone in Europe who could—" "Lucien." Her voice was flat. "I am not asking about the organization. I'm asking about a woman and a child." He was quiet. "You were lonely," she said. "I know. That's what you're going to say. You were away, and it was hard, and one thing led to another, and before you knew it—" "Yes," he said quietly. "And then she was pregnant." "Yes." "And you chose to stay." He didn't answer. "You chose," Naomi said, "to let your daughter grow up knowing who her father was, while your wife in Chicago was being told you were 1,000 miles away doing necessary things." She paused. "While I was losing pregnancies, Lucien. While I was losing pregnancies and you were building a nursery somewhere in Vienna." The word nursery cracked something in the room. Lucien's jaw tightened in a way she recognized, the way he held pain when he refused to let it show. And for a half-second, she felt the pull of it, the old reflex to soften, to reach across the table, to give him something. 3 years of marriage was in her body like a habit. She felt it, and she let it pass. I made a choice I can't undo, he said. I know that. Did you love her? Silence. Did you love her, Lucien? While you were telling me you loved me? While you were calling me every night and asking how I was feeling and telling me it wouldn't be much longer, did you love her at the same time? He looked at her. Yes. She absorbed that. Both of you, he said. I know that doesn't... Stop. She held up one hand. I need you to understand something. I'm not sitting here because I want to hear the version of this that makes you feel better about yourself. I'm sitting here because I wanted to make sure I had the complete picture before I made any decisions. What decisions? She looked at him for a long moment. I have a lawyer, she said. I have an appointment on Friday. The stillness that came over Lucien Moretti in that moment was not the stillness of a man thinking. It was the stillness of a man understanding. Naomi, I want the house. I want the accounts we established jointly. I want sole custody of our child, with visitation to be determined later under conditions I'll have the lawyer specify. She said this clearly, without rushing, the way she read relevant passages to patrons who needed to understand something important. I don't want anything that's connected to the organization. I don't want blood money, just what's legitimately ours. Naomi, you don't have to. We can talk about this. You don't have to make these decisions right now. I've had a week, she said. It's not a rash decision. We have a child coming. I know we have a child coming. Her voice went just slightly on that sentence, a fraction of a degree of warmth that she couldn't fully contain. She pulled it back. Which is exactly why I'm making these decisions now, while I'm clear-headed, instead of after, when everything will be harder and louder. I don't want to lose you, he said. She looked at him. Lucien, she said slowly, you didn't lose me. You chose something, over and over again, for 4 years, and then you came to bed and you held me, and you told me things that were not entirely true, and that is not something that happened to you. That is something you did. She stood up, steadying herself with one hand on the table, the weight of the pregnancy shifting as she rose. The difference matters to me. He stood too, not to approach her, just to stand. If I sign, he said, if I agree to everything you're asking, what happens to the child? Our child. The one, our son will know who his father is, she said. I won't poison that well, but I'm not going to manage your relationship with him from inside a marriage that you turned into something else without telling me. She picked up her phone from the table. I'd like you to stay somewhere else tonight. I'll have the lawyer contact yours. Naomi, tonight, Lucien. He stood there in the kitchen of the house they had chosen together, the house she had repainted and filled with books and believed in as a beginning, and he looked at her with an expression that contained a number of things she could see clearly and probably a number she couldn't. And then, because he was who he was, and because on some level he had always known that this woman's quiet was not the same as weakness, he nodded. He picked up his coat from the chair where he'd laid it. He walked toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the doorframe. The night I met you, he said, you said I was either a good listener or very well trained. You remember that? Yes. I was both, he said, but not with you. With you I just listened. He paused. I want you to know I understood the difference. She said nothing. He left. The door closed behind him with a sound that was very ordinary for the most significant closing it had ever done. Naomi stood in the kitchen alone. She put one hand on her belly. The baby moved, a long, slow roll, the kind that had started to feel like communication, like a small person turning toward something. I know, she said again. She stood there for a while. Then she went to the counter, filled a glass of water, drank it standing up, set the glass in the sink, and went upstairs to bed. She did not sleep. But she lay there in the dark with her hands on her belly and her eyes on the ceiling, and she thought about a woman she had never met, in Vienna, who had also believed she was loved, and she felt, against every instinct she had for self-protection, a grief for that woman too. A grief that was complicated and that she was not ready to sit with fully, but that she acknowledged the way you acknowledge something difficult passing through you, before turning back to face what was directly in front of you. What was directly in front of her was this. She was 7 months pregnant, alone in a house that had become the evidence of a marriage built on an architecture she hadn't known was compromised. And in 4 days she would walk into a lawyer's office and begin the process of dismantling what was left. There was no version of the next several months that was going to be anything other than brutal. She knew that. She lay in the dark and let herself know it fully, without flinching, without the comforting stories she might have told herself about how things would work out, or get easier, or make sense eventually. She let it be exactly as hard as it was. And then, somewhere around 2 in the morning, she felt her son move again. A strong, deliberate kick this time, unmistakable in its insistence. And she pressed her hand to the spot, and she exhaled for what felt like the first time in a week. "Okay," she said quietly, to the dark, to the baby, to whatever came next. "Okay. We go forward." The lawyer's name was Sandra Choi, and she had the kind of office that communicated competence without trying. Clean lines, no clutter, a single framed photograph on the desk turned away from clients so they couldn't see it, which Naomi had always thought was a small dignity. She had represented 3 women from Naomi's book club over the years, 2 divorces and 1 custody modification, and every one of them had said the same thing: Sandra doesn't waste your time, and she doesn't waste your money, and she will not let you be smaller than you are in that room. Naomi had made the appointment 6 days ago, the morning after Lucien left. She sat across from Sandra now, with her coat folded in her lap and her hands resting on top of it, and she laid out the situation in the order it had happened, clearly and without editorializing, the way she'd learned to present information from years of helping patrons navigate research. "Here is what I know. Here is the source. Here is what it means." Sandra listened without interrupting. When Naomi finished, Sandra was quiet for a moment, her pen resting against her notepad. "You said you don't want assets connected to the organization," Sandra said. "Correct. That's going to require some careful forensic accounting to establish what's clean and what isn't. It's doable, but it takes time." "I have approximately 2 months before the baby comes," Naomi said. "Is that enough time to at least have the framework in place?" "If he cooperates." "He'll cooperate," Naomi said, and she said it with a flatness that wasn't confidence exactly, but was something more specific. The certainty of a woman who had spent a week building a complete picture of the man she married and now understood, perhaps better than he understood himself, what he would and would not do when faced with the truth of his own behavior. Sandra looked at her for a moment. "Okay," she said, "then let's build the framework." Lucien's lawyer contacted Sandra's office within 48 hours. Lucien had not hired someone to fight her. He had hired someone to facilitate. That told Naomi something she filed away without comment. The paperwork began moving, slow and procedural, the machinery of legal dissolution grinding forward with the particular indifference of a process that had been designed to handle the worst moments of people's lives, and had long since stopped being surprised by them. Naomi went to appointments. She answered questions. She signed things and initialed things, and read every page before she touched it, which made the process take longer and which Sandra seemed to find professionally satisfying. She was 8 months pregnant by the time the preliminary agreement was drafted. She was managing. And then, on a Tuesday morning in November, Naomi's phone rang with a number she didn't recognize, and she almost let it go to voicemail, and she didn't, and that decision changed everything that came after. The voice on the other end was a woman's, controlled, accented, something Northern European that Naomi couldn't place immediately. Careful in the way. Someone is careful when they have rehearsed what they're about to say, but are not entirely certain they should be saying it. "My name is Vivian Hale," the voice said. "I believe you know who I am." The kitchen went very still. Naomi stood at the counter with the phone pressed to her ear, and she felt every muscle in her body make the precise decision to remain completely motionless. "I know who you are," Naomi said. "I'm calling because there are things you don't know," Vivian said. "Things I think you need to know before you finalize anything. I'm not calling to fight you. I want to be clear about that." "What things?" A pause. Not hesitation, more like someone choosing the right entry point into a large and complicated building. "The lieutenants," Vivian said. "The men inside the organization who have been closest to Lucien for the past several years. You need to understand what they knew and what they encouraged and what they believed they were building." Naomi's grip on the phone tightened slightly. "Keep going." "There are 3 men, Caruso, Ferrante, and a man who goes by Trent, who handles the Chicago logistics. They have known about me and Elise for over 2 years. Lucien did not hide it from them. He told himself he was compartmentalizing. keeping you protected from the knowledge. But the reality is that these men watched him maintain 2 families, and they calculated what that meant for the future of the organization. What does it mean? Naomi said. It means they have been planning, Vivian said. Not recently, for a long time. They watched Lucien divide himself, and they understood, before he did, that a man divided is a man vulnerable. And they began, carefully, quietly, over the past 18 months, positioning themselves to take advantage of that vulnerability. Naomi moved to the kitchen table and sat down. You're describing a coup, she said. I'm describing the early architecture of one, Vivian said. I don't have all of it, but I've been inside the European operations long enough to see the shape of what's being built, the realignments, the conversations that stop when I enter a room, the money that moves in directions Lucien hasn't authorized. A pause. I told him 6 months ago. He didn't believe me. He thought I was trying to consolidate power for myself. Were you? The silence that followed was longer than the previous ones. That is a fair question, Vivian finally said. And I won't insult you with a simple answer. I have my own interests. I have a daughter whose security depends on the stability of a world that is currently very unstable. So yes, I have interests. But what I'm telling you is true regardless of my interests, because the threat doesn't know the difference between what belongs to Lucien and what belongs to the people who depend on him. Why are you calling me? Naomi said. If you've already told Lucien, because the divorce changes the geometry, Vivian said. When word got out, and it got out within days, these things always do, the men who were already planning began moving faster. Naomi. A shift in her, something that dropped the controlled precision and became something raw. Lucien losing you publicly is being read by every ambitious person in that organization as proof that he's lost control of his life, of his judgment, of everything. They are not waiting anymore. Naomi sat with this. What do you want me to do about it? She said. Nothing, Vivian said. I don't want anything from you. I called because... Another pause, and this one sounded like it cost something. I called because you are carrying a child who will grow up in the aftermath of whatever happens next. And I thought you deserved to know the full shape of what that aftermath might be. The line was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry, Vivian said then, not elaborating, not performing it, just saying it plainly into the phone and letting it sit there. Naomi didn't respond to the apology. How long? She said instead. How long before they move? Weeks, Vivian said. Maybe less. The call ended. Naomi put the phone on the table and looked at it. She sat there for a long time, long enough for the light in the kitchen to shift from morning to midday, and she thought about all the ways this information changed what she had believed she understood. She had built a clean picture, betrayal, documentation, legal process, forward motion, a straight line from the worst moment in an airport terminal to a new life she was constructing carefully and deliberately, one appointment at a time. Vivian's call had put a fissure through the middle of that picture, not because the facts of the betrayal were different, they weren't. What Lucien had done was what he had done, and no amount of organizational complexity changed the personal arithmetic of it. But the world her son was being born into was not a clean world. It had never been a clean world. She had known that when she stayed 12 years ago, when she'd sat across from Lucien at her kitchen table and listened to him tell her what he was and made the decision to love him anyway with, she had believed, clear eyes. The clarity, she was understanding now, had been partial. She picked up the phone. She did not call Lucien. She called Marcus. I need you to listen to something, she said when he answered, and I need you not to react until I'm finished. Okay, he said, in the tone of someone who already knew that his ability to not react was about to be tested. She told him everything. When she finished, Marcus was quiet for 4 seconds. She counted. Naomi, he said. I know. You need to tell Lucien. I know. Today. I know, Marcus. Because if something happens to him and you didn't, I know. Her voice was firm. I'm going to call him. I just needed to say it out loud to someone who isn't him first. Yeah. A breath. Okay. You're doing the right thing. I'm doing the necessary thing, she said. I'm not sure they're the same. She called Lucien 20 minutes later. He picked up on the second ring, which told her he'd been waiting, which she didn't know how to feel about. Naomi, I need you to listen, she said. This is not about us. This is about your organization and a phone call I received this morning from someone who believes you're in immediate danger." A beat of silence. Then, in a voice that shifted registers entirely, from the man who had been hoping she was calling to reconsider to the man who had survived inside a violent world for 20 years, "Tell me." She told him. She was precise. She gave him the exact words Vivian had used, as close as she could reproduce them. She noted the things Vivian had said she didn't know, clearly separating them from the things she claimed to know. She had always been a good reporter of information. She didn't editorialize. When she finished, Lucien was quiet for a moment. "Caruso," he said. The word had a specific weight in his mouth. Not surprise. Something closer to confirmation. "You already suspected." "I suspected Caruso," he said slowly. "Ferrante surprised me." "And Trent?" "Trent doesn't have the spine for it," he said. "He's a follower, which means someone's been working on him." A pause. "How did Vivian sound?" "Controlled," Naomi said, and then not. "She's not lying," he said. "Not defending Vivian, just assessing. She doesn't benefit from lying to you. If anything, instability hurts her more than it hurts—" He stopped. "More than it hurts me," Naomi finished, "because I'm leaving and she's still inside it." The silence that followed had a particular texture. "I'm sorry you're in the middle of this," he said. "I'm always going to be adjacent to it," she said. "That's what having your child means." "Naomi, handle your organization, Lucien. Keep yourself in one piece. That's what I'm asking you to do. Not for yourself, but because my son deserves to have the option of knowing his father." She paused. "That's all I have to say." She ended the call. She sat in the kitchen. She put both hands on her belly and she breathed. She had done the right thing. She knew she had done the right thing. That did not make her feel better, and she was past the age of expecting that doing right things would feel like anything particular in the short term. It sometimes felt like nothing. It sometimes felt worse than the alternative. That was the honest truth about moral choices that nobody put on motivational posters. 3 days later, on a Thursday evening when Naomi was at a prenatal appointment reviewing blood pressure numbers with her midwife, Lucien was shot. She found out the way she found out most things she would rather not have found out. Her phone ringing at a bad moment, a voice she didn't expect on the other end, information arriving faster than her ability to organize it. It was a man named Davis, who was technically Lucien's head of security and had been for 6 years, and whom Naomi had met perhaps 8 times, and who had never once called her directly. "Mrs. Moretti," he said. "It's Ms. Brooks," she said automatically. "Ms. Brooks, I need to tell you that Mr. Moretti was shot approximately 2 hours ago. He's alive. He's in surgery. I thought you should know." She was sitting in a paper gown on an examination table when she took this call, her midwife having stepped out to get a chart, the blood pressure cuff still velcroed to her arm. "Where?" she said. Davis told her. A location in the city she knew. She had been there once, years ago, a restaurant Lucien used as a meeting location that she thought was just a restaurant. "What happened?" she said. "I can't go into detail on the phone," Davis said, "but the situation is contained." "Is it?" A pause. "He asked me to call you. That was his first request when he came out of the initial shock. That I call you." Naomi looked at the wall of the examination room. There was a chart on it showing fetal development by week. She was at 34 weeks. "Which hospital?" she said. She went. She was not going as a wife. She was not going as a woman reconsidering anything. She was going because a man who was the father of her child was in surgery, and because Davis had said his first request was that I call you. And she was the kind of woman for whom that information mattered, not sentimentally but factually, the way certain data points shift your understanding of a situation, whether you want them to or not. The hospital waiting room was wrong before she reached it. She knew it from the end of the hallway. The specific arrangement of large men in dark coats, some sitting, some standing, carrying a tension that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with logistics. 3 of them she recognized from years of peripheral awareness. One of them, a thick-set man with gray at his temples and the careful eyes of someone permanently in surveillance mode, she recognized as Caruso. She stopped walking. He was in the waiting room of the hospital where Lucien was in surgery. He was sitting with his legs crossed and a paper coffee cup in his hand and the specific controlled expression of a man performing concern. Naomi stood very still in the hallway and looked at him and understood several things in rapid succession. He was here because a man in his position was expected to be here. He was here because presence, in the hours following an assassination attempt, was the most important currency in an organization trying to assess its own stability. And he was here because he wanted to see who came and how they carried themselves and what the aftermath looked like from the inside. She did not go into the waiting room. She turned and found a nurse and identified herself as the wife of the patient, and was taken, after some careful navigation of the hospital's visiting protocols, to a smaller room away from the waiting area where Davis was sitting alone with his phone and the look of a man who had been awake for 30 hours. "Caruso is in the waiting room," she said before anything else. Davis looked at her. His expression didn't change, but something moved behind it. "I know," he said. "Then you know what that means." "Ms. Brooks, it means he's not done," she said. "It means whatever happened tonight wasn't the completion of something. It was the opening." She sat down across from Davis and looked at him steadily. "Tell me what actually happened." Davis studied her for a moment. Then he told her. It had happened at the restaurant, the one Lucien used, the one she'd been to once. A meeting with Ferrante that Lucien had arranged after her phone call, trying to take the measure of the man, to determine how far the betrayal had progressed. The meeting had been going normally until it wasn't. A complication, Davis was careful about the specific word, had resulted in gunfire. Lucien had been hit once, in the left shoulder. He'd lost significant blood, but the bullet had not hit anything that would kill him if the surgeons did their jobs. Ferrante had not been at the restaurant when the shooting occurred. He had canceled the meeting 40 minutes before, citing something vague. "He knew," Naomi said. "He knew," Davis said. "And Lucien went anyway." Davis was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Moretti is not always willing to believe that people he's trusted for a long time have stopped being trustworthy." "No," Naomi said, "he isn't." She sat with that. "Who was in the room?" she said. "Two of Ferrante's men. And Trent." "Trent was there." "Trent gave the signal," Davis said, with the specific flatness of someone delivering a sentence they'd been thinking about for several hours. "I don't believe he understood what he was signaling, but he gave it. Which meant Trent had been used. Which meant someone had understood Trent's limitations and worked with them rather than against them. Which meant the architecture of this was more sophisticated than a simple betrayal of loyalty. It was a design system, with its own logic and its own redundancies. Naomi leaned back in the chair. "What does Lucien need right now?" she said. Davis looked at her. There was something in his expression that she couldn't fully read. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration of some kind. "Stability," he said. "The organization is watching. Every lieutenant, every associate, every person who has a position that depends on the architecture remaining intact. They're watching to see what happens in the next 24 hours. If there's chaos, they'll move toward whoever appears to have the most control. If there's order," she said. "Yes." "And Lucien can't project order from a surgical table." "No." Naomi sat very still. This was not her world. She had never wanted it to be her world. She was a librarian who loved her mother and was 8 months pregnant and had spent the past several weeks carefully dismantling her connection to everything this world represented. And she was the only person in this hospital who currently had no side to be on. No ambition within the organization, no position to protect, no fear of Lucien, and no loyalty to his enemies. No stake in the outcome except the most fundamental one, the child inside her who would be born into whatever world was left standing when this was over. That was, she understood, a kind of power she hadn't asked for and didn't want, and was going to have to use anyway. "Who can you trust?" she said to Davis. "In the organization, specifically." Davis blinked. "Ms. Brooks, I'm not asking you to tell me organizational secrets. I'm asking you who you trust. Names. Give me 3. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he gave her 3 names. She filed them. "I want you to make sure those 3 men know, tonight, that Lucien is alive and that the situation is being handled," she said. "Not that everything is fine. Don't lie to them. But let them know that there is order, that someone is managing this. Can you do that?" "That someone being me," she said. "Tell them his wife is here and the matter is being handled." The word wife came out of her mouth before she'd made a conscious decision to use it. She let it stand. Davis looked at her for another long moment. "Yes," he said quietly. "I can do that." Lucien came out of surgery at 11:47 at night. He was groggy and in pain and the color of old paper, and the first thing he saw when they allowed her in was Naomi sitting in the chair beside his bed with her coat on and her hands in her lap, and an expression on her face that he looked at for a long moment before he said anything. "You came," he said. His voice was rough from the anesthesia. "I came," she said. "You didn't have to." "I know." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the ceiling. "Trent." "I know about Trent," she said. "Davis told me." "He didn't know what he was doing." "I know that too." Another silence. His hand moved slightly on the bed, not reaching for her, just moving, the restless hand of a man in pain who didn't know what to do with his body. "Caruso's in the waiting room," she said. Lucien's jaw tightened. "I know." "You need to see him," she said. "Tonight, before you leave this hospital. Not because he deserves it, because the men who are deciding which direction to move in the next 24 hours need to see that you received your closest ally in your hospital room after being shot. It tells a story." He turned his head and looked at her. "This isn't your war," he said. "No," she said. "But it's my son's inheritance, and I will not let him be born into a collapsed structure that leaves him exposed." She held his gaze. "So tonight you're going to see Caruso, and you are going to look him in the eye, and you are going to be the most present version of yourself you can manage on anesthesia and one functioning shoulder, and I am going to be in the room." "Why?" "Because he doesn't know what I know," she said. "And because a man like Caruso, who has been calculating vulnerabilities, is going to walk into that room expecting to see a wounded leader in a fractured situation. Instead, he's going to see you and he's going to see me, and he's going to have to recalculate everything he thought he understood about what's been broken." Lucien stared at her. "You understand," she said, "that I am doing this for my son. Not for you, not for the organization. I want you to be clear about that." "I'm clear," he said quietly. "Good." She stood up and went to the door and told the nurse that Mr. Moretti was ready for a brief visitor. Caruso walked into the room 11 minutes later. He was composed. She would give him that. He came through the door with his coffee cup gone, and his expression arranged into something that managed to look like relief and concern simultaneously, which was a difficult performance, and he executed it with the competence of a man who had been performing things for a long time. He looked at Lucien. Then he looked at Naomi. She was standing at the left side of the bed with her coat still on, one hand resting at her side, and she looked back at Caruso with an expression that she had inherited directly from Patricia Brooks. The expression of a woman who has looked at a situation completely, in all its dimensions, and has decided exactly how much of what she knows she is going to let you see. Caruso's eyes moved between them. Something shifted in his face. Not dramatically, just a small recalibration, a door closing behind an eye. He had walked in expecting the geometry of a fractured marriage to be doing his work for him. He was looking at something that didn't fit that expectation. "Lucien," he said, moving forward, extending his hand. "Thank God you're—" "Caruso," Lucien said. His voice was rough but level. He shook the hand. "Sit down. We have things to talk about." Caruso sat, and Naomi stood. And in the small fluorescent room, with the machines beeping their steady rhythms and the hallway noise filtering under the door, the thing that Caruso had spent 18 months carefully constructing met the one variable he had never factored into any of his calculations. The woman he had dismissed. The woman who was not supposed to matter. The woman who, it turned out, had done her research. She did not speak during the meeting. She didn't need to. She stood. That was enough. Caruso left 30 minutes later with an expression she could read plainly. A man who had walked into a room to assess damage and had found, instead, a wall. When he was gone, Lucien let out a long, careful breath that was most of what he had left. "He'll come back," he said. "I know," she said. "This isn't over." "I know that too." She picked up her coat from the chair where she'd laid it while standing. "But tonight you're alive, and he knows you're not alone, and that's what tonight needed to be." "Naomi, get some sleep, Lucien." She moved toward the door. "I'll tell Davis you're settled." "Will you come back tomorrow?" She stopped with her hand on the door. She stood there for a moment. "I don't know," she said honestly. She left. In the hallway, she walked past the waiting room where Caruso's people were still gathered, and not one of them said a word to her, and she kept walking, her hand on her belly, her steps steady, her face arranged into the expression she had learned from her mother, the one that did not show everything, but showed enough. She walked out through the hospital's front doors into the November cold, and she stood on the sidewalk, and she breathed the freezing air, and she thought, I am not the woman I was 3 months ago. Not harder, not colder, just different in the specific way that a person becomes different when the world they were living in turns out to have had walls they couldn't see, and those walls come down all at once, and you realize that the architecture you thought was protecting you was the thing you needed protecting from. She was going to have a baby in 6 weeks. She was going to raise him alone. She was going to build something clean in the ruins of something that had never been entirely clean. And whatever happened inside the Moretti organization in the weeks and months that followed, whatever wars Caruso started and whatever Lucien did or didn't survive, she was going to do it standing up, with her eyes open, and without pretending that any of it was simpler than it was. She hailed a cab. She went home. She did not sleep that night either, but this time the wakefulness was different. It was not the wakefulness of grief or shock, but the particular alertness of a person who has moved through the worst of something and come out the other side still standing, still thinking, still capable of putting one hand on her belly and feeling her son move and thinking, we are still here, and that is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. 6 weeks later, Naomi's son was born at 4:17 in the morning on a Tuesday in December, in the same hospital where his father had been shot, which was not a coincidence she had planned, but which struck her, in the hours afterward, as the kind of detail that a story accumulates when it has been going on long enough. She named him Daniel, not after anyone, just a name that felt like itself, solid, without performance, the kind of name a person could grow into without it ever becoming a burden. Patricia flew in from New York and was in the delivery room, and Marcus drove up from the city where he'd been staying with a friend, and the whole thing was loud and exhausting and specific in the way that births are specific. Not cinematic, not peaceful, not the soft-focus version of the experience that gets sold to women who haven't done it yet. It was brutal and bodily, and then, abruptly, it was the most awake Naomi had ever been in her life. She held Daniel against her chest, and he made the small, furious sounds of a person who had very recently been somewhere else and had opinions about the change, and she looked at his face, red and scrunched and ancient-looking, the way all newborns look ancient, as if they've arrived carrying more than they should. And she thought, there you are. I've been waiting. Patricia stood at her shoulder and cried without trying to stop herself. Marcus stood at the door of the room with his arms folded and his jaw doing the thing it did when he was trying not to cry, which meant he was crying while standing very still. Naomi didn't cry. She was past it, or before it, or somewhere adjacent to it that didn't have a name. She was just there, entirely, for the first time in months. Lucien did not come to the hospital. She had not told him she was in labor. She had not decided not to tell him. It was more that the moment had not presented itself in a way that felt right, and she had learned over the past several weeks to trust that instinct. He found out through Davis, presumably, because Davis seemed to know most things within a reasonable window of their occurrence. He sent a message to her phone sometime around 6 in the morning that said only, I heard, I'm glad you're both okay. His name? She looked at the message for a moment. She typed back, Daniel. A long pause. Then, good name. She put the phone face down on the bedside table and looked at her son, who had fallen asleep against her chest with the absolute commitment of someone who had decided this was non-negotiable. And she thought about all the things that word good was doing in that text, all the weight it was carrying, and then she let it go. She had other things to do. The first weeks with Daniel were what the first weeks with a newborn always are, which is to say, relentless, disorienting, punctuated by moments of such specific tenderness that they seemed to belong to a different emotional register than the exhaustion surrounding them. Patricia stayed for 2 weeks. Marcus came on weekends. Naomi navigated the nights alone. The 2 a.m. feedings, the 3 a.m. inconsolable crying that resolved for no apparent reason. 20 minutes after it started, the 4 a.m. silence that was peaceful for exactly as long as it took her to wonder if something was wrong with it. She was tired in a way that sat in her bones. She was also, intermittently and without warning, content in a way that sat somewhere deeper than that. Outside the house, the Moretti organization was not having a quiet winter. She knew this because Davis called twice in the first month after Daniel's birth. Not to alarm her, he said both times, just to keep her informed because Mr. Moretti had asked him to. The calls were careful. Davis was a man who understood the line between information and involvement, and he walked it with precision. What he told her, in the aggregate, was this. Caruso had moved. Not dramatically, not in a single action, but in the incremental way that a careful man makes a large move, shifting resources, pulling loyalties, creating the conditions for a transition that would appear, when it happened, to have been inevitable. Lucien had survived the assassination attempt, but not without cost. The cost was not physical, or not only physical. The cost was what the attempt communicated to every person watching the organization from inside and outside. That the man at the top had enemies who were willing to act, which meant the man at the top was not invulnerable, which in a world organized entirely around the perception of strength meant something that couldn't be walked back. Ferrante had been dealt with in the week following the shooting in a manner Davis did not specify and Naomi did not ask about. Trent had been removed from his position, given a sum of money that communicated the precise nature of his value to the organization, and released into a life he would presumably spend being very quiet. Caruso remained. Caruso was the problem Lucien had not solved, and in the third week of January the reason became clear. Caruso had, over the 18 months of his patient maneuvering, secured the loyalty of enough of the organizational structure that removing him was no longer a simple matter of authority. He was embedded. He was structural. He was the kind of problem that, in the world Lucien operated in, had historically resolved itself through violence. And Lucien, whether from injury, from exhaustion, from some shift in calculation. Naomi couldn't see from the outside, had not committed to that resolution. Davis told her this in their second call, in early February. He's hesitating, Davis said. He didn't explain why. He didn't need to. Naomi thought about Lucien hesitating, and she thought about what hesitation looked like in a world that read it as weakness. And she thought about Daniel asleep in the next room, and she felt a coldness settle in her chest that was not fear, but was adjacent to it. Tell him to stop hesitating, she said. Ms. Brooks, tell him, she said. That's not a request for organizational involvement. That's a message. Tell him his son is healthy and gaining weight, and that hesitation is a luxury that only works if you're not already a target. A pause. I'll tell him. She ended the call and went and stood in the doorway of Daniel's room and watched him sleep and thought, I did not build this life to have it unmade by a man in a waiting room who underestimated me. She thought about Caruso sitting in that hospital chair with his paper coffee cup. She thought about the expression on his face when he'd walked into Lucien's room and found her standing there. She had read that expression correctly in the moment, and she read it correctly now. Surprise, recalculation, and then the quick closing off of a man who had decided the variable was manageable. He had been wrong about that, but he didn't know it yet. On the 14th of February, which was not a date she chose for its symbolism, but which acquired it anyway, Naomi's lawyer Sandra called with news that the preliminary divorce agreement had been signed by Lucien's legal team and was now a formality pending a brief court appearance in March. It's a generous settlement, Sandra said. More generous than I expected, frankly. He doesn't want to fight, Naomi said. No, Sandra agreed. He doesn't. After she hung up, Naomi sat at the kitchen table with Daniel in the bouncy chair beside her, where he was engaged in the serious occupation of staring at his own hand, and she thought about the document that was about to legally dissolve the structure that had organized her life for 3 years, and she waited to feel something definitive about it. What she felt was complicated and not reducible to a single emotional note, which was honest and therefore something she could work with. She felt the loss of what it had been before she knew what it was. She felt relief, which she had not expected to feel so clearly. She felt a low, persistent grief that was not about Lucien specifically, but about the version of the future she had believed in while she was building it. The version where the difficult years of infertility and loneliness were an arc that resolved into something solid and shared and worth what they'd cost. That version was gone. She let it be gone. Then she picked Daniel up from the bouncy chair because he had started to make the preliminary sounds of someone reconsidering his current situation, and she held him against her shoulder and walked to the window, and she looked out at the February street, gray, cold, a car moving slowly through slush, 2 people walking a dog that was deeply unhappy about the weather. And she thought, this is what is actually here. This street, this morning, this weight on my shoulder. This is what's real. She was still standing at the window 20 minutes later when her phone rang. Unknown number. International code she recognized as European. She answered. "It's Vivian," the voice said. Naomi waited. "They took Elise," Vivian said. The street outside went very still, or seemed to, the way the world outside does when the thing happening inside a room becomes large enough to absorb everything else. "Say that again," Naomi said. "Caruso's people." Vivian's voice was controlled in the way that a voice is controlled when the alternative is complete disintegration. "This morning, she was at nursery school. 2 men." A breath. "They didn't hurt her. They left a message." "What message?" "That Lucien has 48 hours to sign a transition of organizational authority to Caruso's council, or they send Elise back in pieces." Naomi's hand tightened on Daniel. She moved to the armchair and sat down with him still against her shoulder, and she said, "Does Lucien know?" "Yes. I called him first. He's—" A fractured pause. "He's not in a good state." "Where are you?" "Vienna." "Where is Caruso?" "We believe Chicago," Vivian said. "He flew in 2 days ago. We didn't know why." Because he was making sure the move landed, Naomi thought. Because a man like Caruso understands that the force of a threat depends on proximity. He wanted to be in the same city as the man he was threatening when the threat arrived. She thought about Caruso's face in that hospital room. She thought about the door she had seen closing behind his eyes. "Vivian," she said, "Elise is 3 years old." "I know what she is," Vivian said, and her voice finally cracked on that sentence. Just slightly, just enough. "Lucien cannot sign that document," Naomi said. "I know. If he signs it, Caruso controls the organization, which means Caruso controls every asset and every liability and every person connected to it, including you, including Elise, even after they return her, including anyone Lucien has ever—" She stopped. "I know," Vivian said again. "I know all of this." "Then what do you need from me?" A silence. "There's a man," Vivian said carefully. "A man who handles certain financial infrastructure for the organization. Not Caruso's faction, the structural infrastructure that predates any of this. His name is Reston. He's based in Chicago. He's the only person outside of Lucien himself who has access to the account structures that Caruso needs in order to make a transition of authority actually functional. Without Reston's cooperation, Caruso's document means nothing. It's organizational theater. He can claim power, but he can't actually execute it." "And Reston," Naomi said slowly. "Which side is Reston on?" "Neither," Vivian said. "That's what makes him useful and what makes him dangerous. He has worked for the organization for 11 years, and he has never taken a side in any internal dispute because his value depends entirely on his neutrality. But if Lucien is incapacitated, legally, physically, in any way that appears permanent, Reston will work with whoever has the clearest authority. So Lucien needs to get to Reston before Caruso does." "Lucien cannot get to anyone right now," Vivian said. "He's—" "Naomi. He walked out of surgery 2 months ago, and he has been holding the organization together with his left hand while his right shoulder heals, and his 3 closest lieutenants either betrayed him or were compromised, and now his daughter has been taken, and he is not—" She stopped. "He is not himself." Naomi sat very still. Daniel made a small sound against her shoulder, and she shifted him slightly, her hand moving in the automatic rhythmic pat that she had developed in the past 6 weeks without noticing when she'd learned it. "What is Reston's number?" she said. "Naomi." "Vivian, his number." She heard the sound of Vivian making a decision on the other end of the line. It sounded like a breath let out. Vivian gave her the number. Naomi ended the call. She sat for a moment. She thought about the fact that she had a 6-week-old baby and a pending divorce settlement, and a life she was in the process of constructing from the ground up, and that none of those things had any obvious relationship to what she was about to do. She thought about Daniel. She thought about Elise, who was 3 years old, and in the hands of men who had been precise enough to send a message, and careless enough about human cost to use a child to send it. She thought about the fact that she was the only person in this situation who had no organizational stake, no personal history with Caruso, no position to protect, and no fear of losing one, which made her, in the specific geometry of this crisis, the only person who could walk into a room with Reston without signaling aside. She called Marcus. I need you to come watch Daniel, she said when he answered. Right now, today. What happened? I'll explain when you get here. Drive fast. She hung up. She called the number Vivian had given her. It rang 3 times. Reston, a voice answered. Flat. Careful. The voice of a man who had been doing what he did for 11 years by being very good at giving nothing away in the first syllable. My name is Naomi Brooks, she said. Until recently I was Lucien Moretti's wife. You don't know me. A pause. No, I don't. I need to meet with you today. This afternoon, if possible. What I have to tell you involves the situation currently developing inside the organization, and it involves your specific role in what happens next. I'm not calling on behalf of Lucien. I'm not calling on behalf of Caruso. I'm calling on behalf of a 3-year-old girl who has nothing to do with any of this. Silence. I'm at the Fairmont, Reston said. 3 o'clock. Marcus arrived at noon. Naomi handed him Daniel with a briefness that was not coldness, but was efficiency, the way she moved when there wasn't time for anything else. And she told him what she could in 10 minutes, the broad shape of it, the stakes, what she was going to do. Marcus listened without interrupting, which was how she knew he understood it was serious. You don't have to do this, he said when she finished. Someone has to, she said. Someone in the organization. Everyone in the organization has a side, she said. I don't. That's the only reason this works. Naomi. He looked at her. If this goes wrong, then you raise Daniel, she said, and you tell him his mother was not a woman who stood still when children were in danger. That's all. She picked up her coat. She left. The Fairmont lobby was mid-afternoon quiet. A few business people, a couple checking in, the ambient sounds of a hotel doing what hotels do. Naomi walked through it with her coat buttoned and her bag over one shoulder and the particular composure she had learned over the past several months to wear as a functional garment rather than a performance. Reston was already in the restaurant, at a corner table where he could see both the entrance and the room. He was in his mid-50s, she estimated, with the kind of face that had never been memorable and had possibly been cultivated that way. Medium height, medium coloring, the unremarkable presentation of a man whose value had always been in what he knew rather than who he was. He watched her cross the room. He did not stand up. She sat down across from him. He looked at her for a moment. You're younger than I expected. You're exactly what I expected, she said. Something shifted in his expression, not offense, more like a reassessment. Tell me what you think you know, he said. She told him, not everything. She didn't have everything, and she was not going to pretend she did, because men like Reston identified performance of knowledge as quickly as they identified gaps in it. She told him what she knew, the timeline of Caruso's consolidation, the nature of Ferrante's removal, the way Trent had been used, the 48-hour ultimatum, and the specific mathematical problem of a transition of authority that required his cooperation to be functional. He listened without expression. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. You understand, he said, that my value to the organization depends on my not becoming involved in internal politics. I understand that's what you tell yourself, she said. I also understand that a transition to Caruso's council doesn't preserve your neutrality. It ends it, because Caruso's council is not the organization. It's a faction that has taken the organization hostage. Those are different things, and working with one is not the same as working with the other. Reston looked at her. The organization, she continued, as a structural entity, the one you've worked within for 11 years, continues to exist as long as its current authority structure remains intact. Caruso's document doesn't transition authority. It destroys it and substitutes his own. When that happens, your neutrality is not preserved. You become his asset, and men like Caruso don't pay for assets. They own them. A silence. What do you want me to do? Reston said. Nothing that isn't already within your authority to do, she said. I want you to make clear to Caruso's people, through whatever channel you use to make things clear, that your cooperation with any transition document is contingent on the safe return of the child, that without that condition, you will not touch the account structures, and that you have the means to make those structures inaccessible for a period long enough to make the 48-hour deadline meaningless. Reston studied her. That puts me in direct opposition to Caruso, he said. It puts you in opposition to a specific action, she said. Not to Caruso personally. You're not choosing sides. You're setting a condition. There's a difference, and a man in your position knows how to communicate that difference to people who understand it. He looked at her for a long moment. He picked up his coffee cup. He drank from it. He set it back down. If I do this, he said, and the child is returned, what happens to the organization? That's not my problem, she said. Lucien survives or he doesn't. The organization stabilizes or it doesn't. I'm not here about that. I'm here about a 3-year-old girl. You're here about more than that. She met his eyes. Yes, she said. I'm here about what my son inherits, which, ideally, is nothing from this world. But I'm realistic about what ideally means. Reston was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Finish your water. I have a call to make." He stood up and walked toward the back of the restaurant with his phone in his hand. Naomi sat at the table. She put her hands flat on the white tablecloth and felt her heartbeat in her palms, which was not something she normally noticed, but which she noticed now. Steady, slightly elevated, entirely her own. She thought about Daniel. She thought about Elise. She thought about Vivian in Vienna, sitting with the particular terror of a mother who did not know where her child was. And she thought about the complicated and irreducible fact that she felt that terror on Vivian's behalf, felt it genuinely, even though the architecture of how Elise came to exist was the architecture of her own betrayal. The heart, she had learned, did not organize its sympathies according to what was convenient. Reston came back 12 minutes later. He sat down. He looked at her. "The message has been sent," he said. "We'll know within the hour whether it was received in the spirit intended. And if it wasn't, then we move to the next option," he said, "which I'll handle on my end." "What's the next option?" "You don't need to know that," he said, not unkindly, "and you're better off not knowing it." She accepted that. They sat in a not quite comfortable silence, two people who had not known each other 3 hours ago and who were now waiting together for the outcome of something that would determine the shape of several lives. Naomi's phone buzzed at 4:47. It was Vivienne. One word, safe. Naomi put the phone on the table. She breathed. Reston saw her expression and understood it. "Good," he said. "Yes," she said. She put on her coat. She stood up. Reston looked up at her from the table. "You should know," he said, "that what you did today will not go unnoticed. Inside the organization, there are people who will know it was you." "I know," she said. "That changes your position." "My position," she said, "is that I am a private citizen with a 6-week-old son and a library card and a lawyer named Sandra who is very good at her job. Whatever the organization thinks about me is the organization's concern." She picked up her bag. "Thank you for meeting me," she said. She left the restaurant. Outside, the February air hit her with the cold, specific force of a Chicago winter, the kind that doesn't negotiate. And she stopped on the sidewalk for a moment and tilted her face up slightly and let it hit her. And she thought, Elise is safe. Daniel is with Marcus. Sandra has the paperwork. Move. She called a cab. She was halfway home when her phone rang again. Lucien. She answered. "She's home," he said. His voice was rougher than she'd ever heard it, stripped of everything, down to the bare material of it. Vivian called. "Elise is home." "I know," Naomi said. A silence. "Reston told me," Lucien said, "what you did." She said nothing. "Naomi." His voice broke on her name. Not dramatically, just at the edge of it, at the place where held things finally stop being held. "Why?" "Because she's 3 years old," she said. "She's not—" He stopped. "She's not your responsibility. She's not—" "She didn't ask to be born into any of this," Naomi said. "Neither did Daniel. That's the only thing they have in common that matters, and it was enough." The cab moved through the darkening city. "Caruso," she said. "He's still in Chicago." "I know." "Then you know what you have to do." A long silence. "Yes," he said. "Then do it," she said, "and then get your organization under control. Not for me, not for the money or the territory or whatever keeps men like you moving through a world like that. Do it because there are children in the aftermath of this, and they deserve a world that isn't perpetually on fire." The cab stopped at a red light. "I'm sorry," Lucien said. Not for the first time, but differently than the times before. "I know," she said. She meant it. "Naomi," Lucien. She watched the light change. Handle Caruso. I'll see you at the custody hearing in March. She ended the call. The cab pulled up to her house. She went inside. Marcus was in the armchair with Daniel asleep on his chest, both of them out cold. Marcus's head tipped back at an angle that was going to hurt his neck in an hour. Daniel's fist curled against Marcus's collarbone with the absolute trust of someone who had no reason yet to do anything other than trust. Naomi stood in the doorway and looked at them. She did not move for a long time. Then she went to the kitchen and made tea and sat at the table in the quiet of the house and waited for her hands to stop shaking, which took longer than she expected and which was fine, because the shaking was just the body catching up to what the mind had already processed. And she had learned in the past several months to give her body the time it needed to arrive where her mind had already been. Outside, the city continued its cold, indifferent business. Somewhere across that city, Lucien Moretti was making a decision she would not be told about. Somewhere in Vienna, a 3-year-old girl was home. And in a kitchen in Chicago, Naomi Brooks sat with her tea and her shaking hands, and the knowledge that she had walked into the most dangerous room of her life that afternoon, without a weapon, without a position, without anything except the specific clarity of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing and exactly why, and had come out the other side still standing, still standing. She wrapped both hands around the mug. She held on. Caruso was arrested on a Thursday morning in late February, which was not how Naomi had expected it to end, and which was probably not how Lucien had planned it either, but which was, in the specific accounting of how things resolve in a world where violence tends to compound rather than conclude, the cleanest possible outcome. She read about it in the Tribune, a brief item, 3rd page of the Metro section, the kind of article that tells you almost nothing while technically telling you everything. Vincent Caruso, 58, a Chicago businessman with alleged ties to organized crime, was taken into federal custody Thursday on charges, including extortion, conspiracy, and kidnapping across state lines. There was a photograph. He looked smaller in it than he had in the hospital waiting room. She read the article twice, folded the paper, and set it beside her coffee cup. Daniel was in the bouncy chair on the kitchen floor, engaged in the serious project of trying to locate his own feet, which he had discovered 3 days ago and which seemed to genuinely astonish him every time. "They got him," she said to Daniel, who did not respond, because he was 4 feet away from his own feet in a developmental sense and had more pressing concerns. She finished her coffee. She did not feel triumphant. She had wondered, in the weeks of waiting since the conversation at the Fairmont, whether she would feel something clean and definitive when it ended. The particular satisfaction of a story resolving at its proper conclusion. What she felt instead was something quieter and more complicated. A loosening, not of tension exactly, but of the vigilance she had been carrying since November, the sustained alertness of a woman who had been managing proximity to danger for months, and had developed the habit so thoroughly that she'd stopped noticing its weight until it began, incrementally, to lift. She called Marcus. "I saw," he said when he answered. "Good. You okay?" "I don't know yet," she said. "I think so." "That's an acceptable answer. How are you?" "I'm good, Nay." His voice had the warmth it always had when things were okay. The specific warmth that she associated with him at 9 years old, coming to find her in their shared bedroom after their father left. Not saying anything, just sitting down on the floor near her bed and being there. "I'm really good. Thank you," she said, "for everything these past months." "You don't thank family," he said. "I know, I'm doing it anyway." She heard him smile through the phone. After she hung up, she sat for a while and let the morning be what it was. February light coming through the kitchen window at the low angle it kept all winter, Daniel working on his feet, the particular quiet of a house that had become, gradually and without ceremony, a home. She had repainted the living room in January, not because the color had been wrong, but because she had needed the walls to be something she had chosen, not something she'd inherited from the version of herself who had moved into this house as someone's wife. She'd picked a color called Yarmouth Blue, which was actually more gray than blue in most lights, and which she found she liked more every day. She had rearranged the bookshelves. She had donated 3 boxes of things to the Goodwill on Clark Street and had not missed any of them. She had started seeing a therapist named Dr. Reyes on Tuesday afternoons, which she'd begun because Sandra had recommended it, and continued because it turned out to be the 1 hour of the week when she was allowed to not have a plan for what came next, which was more valuable than she'd expected. Dr. Reyes had a specific and useful habit of asking questions that sounded simple and weren't. "What do you want your life to look like in 5 years?" she had asked in their third session. Naomi had sat with that question for a long time, not because she didn't have an answer, but because she'd realized, sitting there, that she hadn't actually asked herself that question in years. She had organized her life around what she and Lucien wanted, and before that, around what was practical, and before that, around what was possible. "Quieter than this," she had finally said. "What does quiet mean to you?" "Honest," she said. "I think I mean honest. A life where what I see is what's actually there." Dr. Reyes had written something in her notepad and hadn't said anything else, which was the right response. The custody hearing was in March, on a gray Tuesday that smelled like incoming rain. Sandra had walked her through it twice, which meant Naomi knew exactly what to expect, which meant she was not surprised by any of it, which was how she preferred to encounter difficult things. Lucien's lawyer was a careful, quiet man named Whitfield, who had the demeanor of someone who had long ago made peace with the fact that his job required him to be present at the worst moments of other people's lives, and who had developed a particular professional gentleness in response to this. Lucien was in the courtroom. She had known he would be and had prepared herself for the experience of seeing him in a formal context, in a room whose purpose was to distribute the legal remains of what they'd had. She thought she was ready. She was mostly ready. He was thinner than she remembered from the hospital. The shoulder seemed healed. He held himself without the compensating posture of someone protecting an injury. But he had the look of a man who had not been sleeping well, which in the context of his life over the past several months was neither surprising nor something she could feel too much about. He looked at her when she walked in. She nodded. He nodded back. That was all. The hearing took 40 minutes. Sandra had been right. It was procedural, specific, and as dignified as these things could be, which was to say, moderately. Lucien did not contest anything. His lawyer confirmed the terms. Naomi's lawyer confirmed the terms. A judge asked several questions that were answered by lawyers and signed several documents and stated for the record that the dissolution was granted and that the custody arrangements were as specified and that both parties were to comply with the terms as outlined. Then it was over. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Lucien fell into step beside her, which she had also prepared for. "Can I walk with you for a minute?" he said, not asking to talk, just to walk. She looked at him for a moment. "Okay," she said. They walked down the corridor of the courthouse without speaking, past the wood-paneled walls and the bulletin boards with their official notices and the other people carrying the weight of their own legal situations. It was not comfortable. It was not dramatic. It was two people who had once known each other with the specific intimacy of a shared life walking beside each other through a public building, which was its own kind of strange. "Caruso," he said at the end of the corridor. "I know," she said. "I saw the paper." "The federal case will hold. There's enough." He paused. "Reston made sure of it." She didn't ask how Reston had made sure of it. She didn't want to know. "The organization," he said then. A longer pause. "I've been in conversations with some people. Federal people." He said this carefully, watching the wall rather than her face. "About a possible arrangement." She stopped walking. He stopped too, and looked at her. "Cooperation," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. She understood what he was telling her. Not the details. She would not be told the details, and did not want them. But the shape of it. A man who had built a criminal empire for 20 years, looking at the wreckage of what the past year had made of it, and making the calculation that the thing he'd been protecting was no longer worth protecting, or no longer existed in a form that could be protected. "Is it going to be enough," she said, "to keep you out?" "Probably not entirely," he said. "There'll be time served, most likely. My lawyer thinks—" He stopped. "I'm not telling you this because I want anything from you. I'm telling you because of Daniel, because if I'm unavailable for a period of time, I want you to know that it's coming, and I want there to be a plan." She thought about Daniel on the kitchen floor reaching for his own feet. She thought about what it meant to tell a child, at whatever age the conversation needed to happen, about the world his father had occupied and the choices that world had required. "Okay," she said, "we'll make a plan." He looked at her with an expression she had seen on his face before, a long time ago, the first time he'd told her what he really was. The expression of a man who had expected something and received something different and was recalibrating in real time. "You're not angry," he said. "I'm past angry," she said. "I've been past it for a while." "What are you?" She thought about that. "Tired," she said. "And I'm a mother. And I have a lot of work to do." She picked up her bag. "Sandra will be in touch about the plan." She walked toward the exit. She did not look back. Outside, the rain had started. The light early spring rain that couldn't decide whether it was serious about itself, spattering the courthouse steps with a half-hearted randomness. She pulled her coat closed and walked to her car, and she sat in it for a few minutes without starting it, watching the rain on the windshield, and she did something she hadn't done in a very long time. She let herself feel sorry. Not for herself specifically, not for Lucien specifically, just sorry. For the general human talent for building things and then breaking them. For the way love that starts clean tends to accumulate the grime of every compromise and omission and chosen blindness until you can't find the original surface anymore. She felt sorry for the version of herself who had sat across from Lucien at her kitchen table 12 years ago and listened to him tell her what he was and decided it was something she could live alongside. That woman had not been foolish. She had been hopeful. There was a difference. She started the car. She drove home. The months that followed had their own rhythm, which was less cinematic and more actual, the rhythm of a woman raising an infant while rebuilding a life from its functional components, which requires the kind of steady, unremarkable courage that doesn't make good footage but which is, in the accounting of a life, the most important kind. Daniel grew. That was the central fact of the spring and summer. Daniel growing at the rate infants grow, which is so fast it seems impossible, each week presenting a face that was slightly more a person than the week before. He smiled at 6 weeks. He laughed at 3 months, a sound so sudden and so specific to itself that Naomi had to sit down when she first heard it. He started reaching for things and then grasping them with the focused intensity of someone doing important work. He slept in gradually longer stretches that eventually organized themselves into something approximating a night, which restored to Naomi a quality of consciousness she had begun to think she might not access again. She went back to work in June. The library had held her position. They were required to, but her supervisor, a dry and kind woman named Dolores, had also clearly wanted to, which Naomi appreciated in a way that she expressed by arriving on her first day back with a very good coffee cake and saying nothing sentimental about it. Being back in the library was, unexpectedly, one of the most restorative things that happened to her that year. Not because it was easy or because she didn't think about everything else while she was there. She did. But there was something about the particular function of a library, the way it organized the world's accumulated knowledge and made it available to whoever came looking, without judgment, without agenda, that she had always found steadying. Information did not betray you. A book did not have a second life you didn't know about. A well-organized reference section was, in its modest way, a promise kept. She found herself doing what she'd done after her father left, at 9 years old, reading widely and without a specific destination, following threads wherever they led. She read about trauma and resilience, which she'd expected. She read about organizational psychology, which she hadn't. She read 3 novels in a row that had nothing to do with anything in her life and everything to do with what she needed, which was to spend time in other people's problems for a while. She kept seeing Dr. Reyes on Tuesdays. In September, 8 months after the Fairmont meeting, she had a conversation with Dr. Reyes that she would remember for a long time after. She had been talking about a woman she'd helped that week, a patron, maybe 60 years old, who had come in looking for information about starting over after a long marriage ended, and who had seemed so lost in the specific way of someone who had organized their entire identity around a relationship and did not know what was left without it. "What did you tell her?" Dr. Reyes asked. "I gave her some resources," Naomi said. "Information on financial independence, support groups, that kind of thing." She paused. "But I also told her, I said something I hadn't planned to say. I told her that starting over wasn't really starting over. That she wasn't starting from zero, she was starting from everything she already knew about herself, which was more than it felt like from the inside." Dr. Reyes was quiet for a moment. "Did you believe it when you said it?" Naomi thought about that. "Yes," she said. "I did. I actually did." Dr. Reyes wrote something down. "What?" Naomi said. Nothing dramatic, Dr. Reyes said. Just noting that 6 months ago when we started, you couldn't have said that and meant it. Naomi sat with that. No, she said, I couldn't have. In October, she had lunch with Sandra, not about legal matters, just lunch, which they had both decided they wanted now that the professional necessity of each other had resolved into something that felt more like the beginning of a friendship than its occasion. Sandra ordered wine and Naomi ordered sparkling water, and they talked about things that were not the case mostly. And somewhere in the middle of the lunch, Sandra said, unprompted, "You should think about what you want to do with what you know." What do you mean? I mean you spent the better part of a year navigating something that would have broken most people, Sandra said, with the bluntness that made her good at her job. You came out the other side with a specific kind of knowledge about how women survive institutional betrayal, organizational, marital, systemic. That knowledge is not nothing. It's actually something a lot of women need access to and can't find. Naomi looked at her. You're telling me to start a foundation, she said. I'm telling you to think about it, Sandra said. Naomi thought about it. She thought about it for the rest of the lunch, and on the drive home, and while she fed Daniel his dinner, and while she washed the dishes, and while she sat in the reading chair after he was asleep with a book open in her lap that she wasn't reading. She thought about the woman in the library who had seemed so lost. She thought about Vivian Hale in Vienna, who had called her not as an enemy, but as a mother, which was the most complicated and most human thing Vivian could have done, and which Naomi had not fully processed until much later. She thought about Patricia, who had raised 2 children alone and never poisoned the well, and had spent 40 years of her life as a resource for other people without anyone building a structure around it. She thought about what she knew. She thought about what it was worth and who it might help. She started making notes that night. They were not organized notes. They were the rough first notes of a person following a thread without knowing yet where it went. Thoughts about resources and gaps, about what women in crisis situations needed and couldn't find, about the specific intersection of emotional abuse and institutional power that she had spent 3 years living inside without knowing the name for it. She filled 7 pages before midnight. She felt, for the first time in a long time, like someone building something rather than clearing away the remains of something destroyed. In November, when Daniel was 11 months old and had recently discovered that he could pull himself to standing by gripping the coffee table and then look at her with an expression of such complete astonishment at his own achievement that she laughed every time without managing to be prepared for it. In November, Lucien came to see his son for the first time. She had arranged it through Sandra and his lawyer Whitfield, which meant it was organized and documented and conducted within the boundaries of the custody arrangement, which meant she had done everything right, and it was still one of the harder afternoons of the past year. He arrived at 2 o'clock. She opened the door. He looked different, not drastically, not in a way that told a clear story, but in the specific way that a person looks different when they have been living inside consequences rather than managing around them. Something around his eyes. Something in the way he stood on her front step with his hands at his sides instead of in his pockets. The posture of a man who had decided not to be comfortable on someone else's ground. Come in, she said. He came in. Daniel was on the living room floor surrounded by the organizational chaos of someone who had recently discovered that objects could be moved from one place to another and was conducting extensive research on this phenomenon. He looked up when Lucien came into the room. He looked at Lucien. Lucien looked at him. Something happened in Lucien's face that Naomi was not able to look at directly. She looked at the window instead, and then at the bookshelf, and she heard behind her, not a sound exactly, but the quality of a silence that had specific weight, the silence of a man encountering something that undid the composure he had walked in with. She turned back around. Lucien was on one knee on the floor, not reaching for Daniel, but simply being there, at his level, letting Daniel study him with the thorough and unsentimental assessment of a person who had not yet learned to pretend to feel things he didn't feel. Daniel reached out and took hold of Lucien's finger, the way infants take hold of things, completely, without reservation, the grip of someone who does not yet know about appropriate caution. Lucien looked at that small hand around his finger. He made a sound that she would not describe. She went to the kitchen and stood at the counter and looked out the window at the November backyard, which was stripped and gray and had 3 squirrels in it doing what squirrels do. And she breathed. She was not going to feel sorry for him. She was not going to not feel sorry for him. She was going to stand in the kitchen and let the afternoon be what it was, and not manage it into something simpler than it was, because it was not simple, and trying to make it simple would be dishonest. And she had decided, some months ago, that she was done with dishonesty in all its forms, including the comforting kind she deployed on herself. She made tea. She brought 2 cups to the living room. Lucien was sitting on the floor now, cross-legged, and Daniel was showing him a wooden block with the insistence of someone who has identified this object as important and wants verification. Lucien was paying attention with the totality of a man who understood that he was being given something he did not deserve and was trying to be completely present for it. She set the cups on the coffee table. She sat on the couch. They stayed like that for a while, the 3 of them, in the living room of a house that used to be theirs and was now hers, in an afternoon that was neither what any of them had planned and was exactly what it was. "He's healthy," Lucien said eventually. Not a question. "Very," she said. "Strong." "He keeps standing up and falling down and standing up again," she said. "He finds the whole process hilarious." Something moved across Lucien's face that was the closest thing to a real smile she had seen from him in a long time. "He gets that from you," he said. She looked at him. "The standing up part," he said. She picked up her tea. They were quiet for a while. "The arrangement with the federal people," she said. "Is it settled?" "Yes." His voice was neutral. 18 months. I start in January." She absorbed that. "Where?" "Minimum security facility in Wisconsin. Not far." He looked at Daniel. "I wanted you to know before it was public." "I appreciate that." "I want to write to him," he said. I want to be able to write to him. If that's... I'll read the letters to him until he's old enough to read them himself," she said. "That's the best I can offer right now." He looked at her. "That's more than I expected," he said quietly. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," she said. "I'm doing it for him. So he grows up knowing his father tried to be present. Not because you earned it, but because he deserves to have the information and make his own judgments when he's old enough." Lucien was quiet. "Is there anything?" he started. "No," she said. Not unkindly, just clearly. "There's nothing I need from you right now. There may be things later that Daniel needs. When that happens, I'll let you know through the proper channels." She set her cup down. "But you and we've said what there is to say. I think we both know that." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yeah," he said. "We do." He stayed another hour. When he left, he crouched down to Daniel's level again and said something she couldn't hear from across the room, and Daniel looked at him with the grave attention of someone filing information, and Lucien stood up and walked to the door, and she walked him there. At the door he turned. "I taught everyone around me that loyalty could be bought," he said. The words came out like something he'd been holding for a while, considered and deliberate. Every single person in my world understood that as the fundamental rule. Money or power or fear. One of those 3 was always the currency. She waited. "You were the only person I ever met who operated on different math," he said. "I didn't know what to do with that. So I did what I knew instead." He paused. "I'm not telling you this to change anything. I'm telling you because I think you should know that you were right, and I understood you were right, even when I was choosing wrong." She looked at him for a long moment. "I know," she said. She meant, "I knew then, and I know now, and it still cost what it cost." He nodded once. He left. She closed the door. She stood in the hallway for a moment, one hand on the wood of the door, and she thought about a woman in an airport terminal, 7 months pregnant, with her hand pressed flat against her belly, and the world reorganizing itself around a small girl's arms, reaching up. She thought about how far she was from that woman now. Not in time. In time, it was barely a year. But in the way that mattered, in the interior geography of who she was and what she understood and what she was capable of carrying and what she had learned to put down. She went back to Daniel, who had located her phone somewhere on the floor and was extremely interested in it. She took it gently from him. He objected. She offered him the wooden block instead. He considered. He accepted. She sat on the floor beside him, and they spent the rest of the afternoon doing nothing in particular, which was the thing she had come to value most about this life she was building. The reliable ordinariness of it, the way nothing dramatic was required of her in any given moment, the way she could just be present in a room with her son and have that be enough and know that it was enough. 18 months later, in the spring. The Moretti organization formally ceased to exist as an operational entity. The combination of federal prosecutions, Lucien's cooperation, and the internal fracturing that Caruso's failed coup had accelerated brought it down in the incremental way that things which have seemed permanent tend to come down, not in a single dramatic collapse, but in a series of quiet endings that accumulate into a final silence. She read about it the same way she'd read about Caruso's arrest, briefly, in print, setting the paper down beside her coffee. Daniel was 2.5 by then and had opinions about everything and communicated them with a specificity that made her laugh daily. She had by then also incorporated the Bridges Foundation, a resource center and advocacy organization for women navigating the aftermath of betrayal within institutional and family power structures, which was the official language, and which she described to people more simply as, "We help women figure out what's left when the story they were living turns out to be something else." The foundation had 4 employees and a board of 7 women and a small but functional office in Lincoln Park, and 3 active programs and a waiting list, which she found both humbling and motivating in equal measure. It was not the life she had planned. It was, she understood, the life she had earned. On a Saturday afternoon in May, she took Daniel to the park near their house, the one with the old oak trees that had been there long enough to have real weight to them, the kind of trees that made a particular quality of light in spring, green and gold and moving. He ran ahead of her on the path the way 2.5-year-olds run, with his whole body, with a commitment to forward motion that had no interest in efficiency, veering slightly left and then correcting, his arms doing something that was not quite running arms but was entirely his own. She walked behind him, and she watched him, and she let the afternoon be what it was. She was thinking about the Foundation's next program when something made her look up. There was a man on a bench on the far side of the path, maybe 30 yards away, sitting very still in the way that people sit when they are trying not to be noticed and have misunderstood how stillness works. It makes you more visible, not less, when everyone else is in motion. She knew him before she fully processed that she was seeing him. Lucien. He was in civilian clothes, nothing distinctive, the clothes of a man who was no longer performing anything. He was thinner than the last time she'd seen him, which had been at a custody check-in arranged through Whitfield 8 months ago. He looked older in the way that a year inside does to a person, not dramatically but specifically, in the lines and the eyes. He was watching Daniel. Daniel, unaware of everything except the demands of the path ahead, continued his slightly left-veering investigation of the park. Naomi slowed her pace. She watched Lucien watching his son. The expression on his face was not one she could name with a single word. It contained too many things. Loss, obviously, but underneath that, or alongside that, something that was neither regret nor acceptance but lived in the territory between them. Something quiet. Something that had, perhaps, finally stopped fighting itself. He noticed her noticing him. He did not move toward her. He did not call out to Daniel. He simply looked at her across 30 yards of spring afternoon with an expression that was also not reducible to a single word, and she looked back at him with one she hoped communicated what she intended. Not forgiveness, not the erasure of what had happened, not an opening, but acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of a woman who had been through a thing and come out the other side and who could, from the distance she had traveled, look back at where the thing had started without it reaching for her. She gave a small nod. He returned it. Then she turned back toward Daniel. "Daniel," she called, "wait up." He turned around on the path with his arms out for balance, his face lit with the specific joy of being called by someone he trusted, and he waited, his whole body arranged in the attitude of a child who has somewhere to be and is willing to give you one moment to catch up. She reached him. She took his hand. He pulled her forward immediately, back to his project, back to the path, back to the afternoon, and whatever was at the end of it that he'd already decided was worth running toward. Behind her, she knew Lucien was still on the bench. She didn't look back. Not because it hurt to look. Not because she couldn't, but because the direction that mattered was forward, had always been forward, would continue to be forward, and her son's hand was in hers, and the afternoon light was the specific gold that May makes in Chicago when it finally means it, and the trees were moving, and they walked into it together, the two of them, into the ordinary, irreplaceable brightness of a day that asked nothing of her except to be present in it. And she was. She was present. That was the victory, not the fall of an empire, not the resolution of a betrayal, Not the legal documents or the public record or any of the external machinery that had ground its way through the past 2 years. The victory was this: a woman walking forward, her son's hand in hers, in a park, in the light, not looking back. Not because the past wasn't real, but because she was more real than it.